Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. Is it just me, or does it seem like the class is flying by? I can't believe this is week 3. We've only got 10 weeks, which is kind of crazy considering how much we have left to cover. We're certainly, we're not going to do everything. It's a little daunting to think about all the stuff that we could talk about on this topic and the short amount of time we have to do it in. So this is just an introduction, right? So we're gonna do the best we can with the time that we have. Good Memorial Day to all of you. I hope you're all out enjoying it. I hope you've been out doing a few things, maybe having a picnic or a barbecue or whatever. I say Good Memorial Day rather than Happy Memorial Day because it's really, somber. At least it was intended to be a somber holiday. It was started after the Civil War's Decoration Day when family members and citizens would place flowers on the graves of the Civil War vets who had died. But it was adopted as Memorial Day to remember the fallen members of the armed services. Now that doesn't mean that you're not supposed to go out and enjoy it, but I do think it's important to keep in the back of our mind that it is a sort of a somber occasion. So yeah. Anyway, okay. So week 3. Last week, we had our first discussion question. You guys did an awesome job on that. I was very impressed. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So if you guys can keep that up for the next 7 weeks, we should be in good shape. So great job. Well done. Okay, let's see. We've got a quiz coming up this week, I believe. I will open that up on Friday morning. It'll be open from Friday morning until midnight on Saturday. Just exactly the same thing as last time. It'll be open book, but rather than being on the quiz, this one will be on chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Creswell, because we're reading 2 chapters this week, so we'll try to cover as much ground as we can. I'll talk about those a little bit later. But that's the material that the quiz will be on. It'll be a combination of multiple choice and true false, just like the last quiz. Oh yeah, one other thing I've decided to do, because I think it's really important for what we're trying to do, and I didn't incorporate it into the class initially. I've created a discussion for this week. It's under the discussions tab on Canvas, and it is essentially for extra credit. And it's discussing where you are with your research question right now. So if you go into this post, discussion post, and write down, a decent post, right? I mean, it can't just be 1 or 2 sentences. Let's say a paragraph or more about where you are with your current research question, with the question you think you'd like to research at this point. I'll give you 5 additional points. And my intention is to do this every week from here on out. So you'll have a chance to get 5 additional points this week, up through the last week of the class. So if you did that, that would be 40 extra points if you did it every week. And remember, I grade on a point scale, so the total points that you can earn without extra credit is 500. So if you did one of these discussions every week, that would be almost 10% of your grade. So that would be a significant addition to your final grade. It could definitely make the difference between a C and a B or a B and A. So if you do that, something worth, you can really boost yourself up. The reason that I'm doing that is because I think that is the most important thing when we're trying to design a research project, is to continually think about and refine our research question. And remember that this course is part of a sequence, right, in the ISS program. And when you get to the capstone class, which I just taught this past semester, you're going to need to hit the ground running with a research question because that's going to drive your capstone paper. So this will be a good laboratory for us to work on trying to develop that research question, which you can hopefully port over into the capstone class. So to reiterate, I'm going to start posting an extra credit assignment every week from here on out. It's worth 5 points each week, and It's essentially a discussion, write a paragraph or two about what you think your research question is, why you think it's important, why you chose that particular research question. And hopefully, as we go through, I'll comment on them as well and say you may want to think about tweaking here or there. Hopefully the questions will be refined as we go through. And that's also going to help you with the final assignment in this class of writing the research proposal, because as we saw in Chapter 1, and we'll talk a little bit more about today, the question drives the research design, and the research design drives the research methods. So those are the major announcements for the week. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Chapter 1 last week that we looked at. I thought you guys did a good job in the discussions. I think you had a pretty good grasp on what Creswell was talking about. And right, I mean, if we bring it down to its most basic elements, the research design is sort of like a business plan, right? Or it's a plan. It's, here's how I'm going to go about. Here are the different elements of my plan, my research. Here's how I'm going to carry it out. Here's why I'm doing it in this particular way. Here are some of the challenges I think I might face. Just sort of, it's your initial sketch, right? Your initial plan. So what are the major components of this plan? There are three major components of the research design that Creswell talks about. The first one is the philosophical worldview. Right? And if anybody has taken and I know some of you have taken my Intro to Social Sciences class, you've probably heard me talk ad nauseum about paradigms. Right? And that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about philosophical worldview. Now, paradigm, it's a term that was coined by a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn. He wrote a book, I think it was in the 70s maybe, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he posited this idea that rather than science or knowledge throughout human history progressing linearly, okay, we build on this, we're developing this, grand theory, he proposed this idea that there are these worldviews that we live in, right? So if let's say we go back to ancient Greece, right? And they had this worldview that the gods, essentially dictated, what happened in nature, right? So if Zeus was angry, you would have a thunderstorm, right? Or if you felt this great, strong passion towards somebody else, maybe it was Aphrodite at work, right? There are these, and they believed that they were actual beings, right? So that was how they explained the way that the world worked, right? But then let's say Christianity happened, right? So, the worldview according to Christianity is very different than a worldview according to Greek mythology, right? Now, what happens in Christianity happens because God the Father, right, has decided to organize the universe in a particular way, set these sort of laws and principles into effect, and that's what changes, that's what makes things happen the way that they happen, right? And as you can see, there's not a linear progression from Greek mythology to Christianity, right? It's a complete shift. It's something completely different has happened, right? Those are two different philosophical worldviews, or two different paradigms. And then we think about the scientific revolution, right? The Enlightenment, where we actually start believing that we can, use science and use these techniques and methods to actually objectively, determine the forces that are at play in the world. And this is the worldview that many of us still cling to today, right? That we can use certain techniques, certain knowledge to predict, to measure the way that the world is actually set up. But of course, there are challenges. There are challenges to the traditional scientific method as well, right? So I mean, you can even look at something like quantum mechanics, right? So we have the scientific revolution, but there have even been phases within the scientific revolution. Maybe we started out with, Newton's theory of quantum, or Newton's, mechanistic explanation of the universe. And then we have Einstein come along and talk about relativity, which kind of throws that world, a lot of Newton stuff out the window. And then we have quantum mechanics come along that kind of, throws a wrinkle into Einstein's plan, right? And these are all sort of paradigm shifts in a lot of ways. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about philosophical worldviews, and what do you believe? What are you bringing into this study that you're doing? Are you coming from this sort of traditional scientific mentality, which Creswell refers to as post-positivism, right? Which believes that while we can't say certainly that we can have objective knowledge about the world, we feel like that we can have a good probability, perhaps, of knowing that, right? If we apply certain methodologies to it. And then you have constructivism, and of course, this is where we run into some real challenges in doing social sciences. We have to remember in the social sciences we're not dealing with inert things, right? We're dealing with living human beings. So while we might be able to apply, the traditional scientific method to things like noble gases, right, or atoms, it becomes a lot harder to try to apply those methodologies to living human beings, right? And this is something that in philosophy of science is known as the subject-object dilemma, right? Now, in a traditional scientific experiment, the subject is the person who's carrying out the research, right? So it could be me. I'm doing the research, and I'm working on an object, right? The object could be, diamonds or something like that, right? And it's, the relationship between, subject working on conscious being, reflective being, and non-conscious, non-reflective being. The relationship is very different than when you're trying to do a study on another human being who is not, unconscious. You're working on another conscious being. So it's subject. The object in a social science study is the subject themselves. So that complicates things, and that's how we get into these things about bias and things like that, which we'll talk about. So we have post-positivism, sort of the traditional scientific mentality, constructivism, which argues that there is no objective social reality, right? It's that people construct their own meanings of what society is, and it differs from society to society. It's not objective; it's relative to the individuals, right? So yeah, that's sort of the constructivist perspective, which is quite different than the post-positivist. And people often point to these two distinctions as sort of, this is the place where perhaps you're getting into more of a qualitative, quantitative division, which is partially true, but it's not always the case. And Creswell lists two others. He talks about participatory advocacy, which is kind of coming out of a critical theory perspective, right? And that's a whole nother theory, but essentially it says Marxism perhaps is one of Marxism, feminism, things like that. These are the theories that fall under critical theory, and they say that the way society is structured does not take into account equally the perspectives of all the people in society, right? So there are these questions of discrimination, and it's just the powerful and the wealthy in society, the ruling majority, the ruling class, who essentially writes what actually is real, right? This is what's real, but it leaves out all these other perspectives. So that advocacy, participatory, philosophical worldview tries to make sure that all the voices within a certain discourse are being heard, right? So that's the third one. The fourth one that he mentioned was pragmatism, which kind of comes out of an American school of philosophy, the most famous American school of philosophy, pragmatism. John Dewey, William James, Charles Peirce. And they were responding to a lot of this stuff comes out of philosophical debates, right? So you have this, these theories, kind of going with the Enlightenment that says we can prove what reality is. We can objectively know what reality is. And then you have other philosophers coming along saying, like Descartes, for instance, saying, no, you can't, because everything that you think you know is coming through you, right? We don't interact directly with whatever's outside of us, right? We interact through our own subjective lens, right? So there may be a world out there, there's something out there, but we don't know what it is outside of as it appears to us. So that led to these huge philosophical debates about the nature of reality and what we can know about it. And the pragmatists came along and said, okay, well, sure, that may be true, but really what we want to focus on is what works, right? If the knowledge that if I get out of bed in the morning and I throw my feet over the bed, I land on the floor, I don't float to the ceiling, if that happens to be the case, doesn't really matter what's out there. But this particular piece of knowledge that gravity exists in this case works for us, right? It works. So we're gonna stick to that. We're gonna believe that. That's the worldview that we're gonna be coming from. And I think Creswell says that he ties this into sort of the mixed methods approach that says, okay, well, we have both of these methods, and both of them seem to have some validity to them, so let's use them both, and that way we can sort of, get the best of both worlds. Okay, so you got the philosophical worldviews. The next step, the deal is you're supposed to decide, where do I fit, in those paradigms or those worldviews I just laid out. Which one of those speaks to you the most, right? And you can do a little bit more reading into each one of those to go into a little more detail than what I did. But is there one of those that makes more sense to you than the other? But I would also encourage you that if there is one that speaks to you more than the others, don't go in for confirmation bias, right? Because give the others their due, because there is an aspect of truth in all of these, I would say. Try to see. You're going to have general tendencies towards one or the other, but try to see which one fits best for you, but also keep an open mind about the other things as well. Okay, so once we've decided which camp we fit in, which tribe we belong to, the next thing is we try to come up with these things he calls strategies of inquiry. So we're kind of starting at the 10,000 foot level, and then we're moving down to the 5,000 foot level, and then we're going to try to move down, let's say, to the 1,000 foot level or whatever. So 10,000 foot, I fit into the participatory advocacy group. Now I need to figure out, once I know that, there are all these other sorts of like schools of thought within that particular group, and you need to figure out, okay, well, I have this question, and I'm coming at it from this perspective that maybe all these groups, there are lots of marginalized groups out there who have not been really been taken into account when I'm trying to answer this particular question. Maybe it's about the legalization of marijuana or foster care or whatever. I need to figure out what I think the best way is to learn what those people think. Is the best way for me to learn what they think, is it to go to one of these communities and just sort of embed myself in the community and watch and observe and see what happens? Is that going to give me the information that I need? Would I be better served by trying to do some sort of experiment, where I have this theory and I sort of do this test where I do like a pre-test attitudes. I have the treatment, it's called, right, in an experiment, and then I see what their attitudes are afterward and see how that all works. Am I going to be better off by looking at one particular case of this particular group, like one person who I think exemplifies it? And all those are different types of strategies, right? So, looking at one person, that's a case study strategy. Do you think that there may be one case that exemplifies whatever it is that you're interested in? Or if it's observation, that's ethnography or just participant observation, where you're observing, you're being sort of a part of that community, right? And then, of course, experiment, it's an experiment. Okay, so then you have those strategies, right? So, okay, we start off participatory advocacy. We say we're going to do ethnography as our strategy, and then we can go down even farther than that, right? So we say ethnography, and then we can say there are different types of ethnographies. There is, generally speaking, there is a participant observation where you're actually going in and you're interacting with the community and you're doing the same things that they're doing. And there's non-participant observation where you're not participating, you're just watching. So that's just another way that you can break it down even farther. Or maybe within that ethnography you decide you want to do oral histories, where you're just asking somebody to tell you their story. They tell you your story, you write it down, and that's it. Or you want to do interviews, right? So it's just sort of, it keeps going down farther and farther until you actually get to where you're interacting with people on a much more personal basis. So those are the three major aspects of research design that we have to wrap our heads around this semester, and for ultimately working up towards whether it's an honors thesis or a senior thesis for ISS. So those are three things to think about, and he lists some criteria that you can utilize to try to choose. Because you're like, well, okay, I got all these things, and what the heck am I supposed to do with them, right? How am I supposed to make a decision on? Because some elements of post-positivism sound good, some elements of constructivism sound good. How do I decide where I'm going to end up? And he gives you these three criteria, and it's more than that, but it's good starting point, right? The first thing he says is the problem itself. What is your research question, right? Because different questions are going to lend themselves better to different types of methods or different types of strategies. Although what you're going to find is that oftentimes your philosophical worldview will dictate in some sense what kind of question you're actually interested in, right? So, if I'm coming from a constructivist perspective, I'm going to be much more interested in questions about, perhaps different cultures, right? How different cultures view different things, how, different communities, whether it could be the LGBTQ community, how they view things versus how perhaps another community views things. Very interested in sort of the group dynamics, the individual perspectives on things, right? Where you're not necessarily trying to say that, okay, I have this one theory, and I can use this theory to predict everything that I need to know about the world, right? So just even your question itself, the things that you're curious about, will give you some sort of clue as to sort of which philosophical worldview you're actually coming from. So perhaps rather than starting and saying, okay, I'm in this particular philosophical camp, perhaps the thing to do is to think about yourself. Think about, what am I curious about? What kinds of questions are really interesting to me, right? And you start with those questions, and you say, oh, okay, well, I have all these different questions. You can even do that if you want to do that in the writing assignment or the extra credit assignment this week. You can do that and say, here, I'm interested in these 5 or 6 different questions, and then you look at those 5 or 6 questions. You say, okay, well, this has this in common with this. This has this in common with this. Maybe I'm seeing a trend here, and maybe that says, okay, well, I'm coming from a more post-positivist perspective, because I think that there are certain things you can just predict about the world. There are things that we can know. We derive this theory, we put this theory into practice, and if we do so, then we make the world a better place, ideally, right? So you can use the question to actually help figure out what philosophical worldview you're in, but the question also is going to tell you what strategy makes the most sense, right? Perhaps, maybe I'm interested in nuclear deterrence, right, from a political science perspective, or a international politics perspective, and I want to know the role that deterrence plays in nuclear conflicts, or not just nuclear, any conflict, right? Perhaps I think the best way for me to understand nuclear deterrence would be to examine the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is an excellent case study of deterrence at work, right? And I think I can use this one case to really get an understanding of the way deterrence works. That's what I do. Right? That's the strategy that I use. And then, of course, your question is going to, in a lot of ways, dictate what kinds of methods you want. Right? If you want to test a theory or test a hypothesis, perhaps a survey or an experiment is the best way to go about it. If you want to get greater understanding about a particular concept or a particular topic, you want to be more exploratory, perhaps interviews or focus groups or observation even is the way to go about it. Personal expertise or personal experience. I think most of us, certainly our personal backgrounds are going to play a role. Right? Perhaps this is the time to actually talk about bias a little bit, because a lot of times, whichever worldview you're in has a very different perspective on bias, right? And we have to interrogate what we mean by bias a little bit. And I think what we're talking about when we're talking about bias is that we're making certain value judgments about a particular thing. And what role should values play in doing research on these particular kinds of questions right now? Positivism says that good research is value-free, right? We're sort of checking our values at the door when we ask our question, and we're just the facts, ma'am, right? We're just doing the facts. Whereas constructivism and a lot of these other worldviews, constructivism and participatory advocacy as well, say that values are very important, right? Values actually play a critical role in exploring, especially when you're dealing with social questions, right? Because it's a lot easier to leave your bias at the door when you're working. You want to know what the chemical properties of argon are, versus when you want to know, what are the effects of campus rape on, on an academic community, right? It's going to be real hard to leave your values out of that. And in fact, usually the reason that you're interested in that particular question is that there's some sort of value that you have that's leading you to that. And I think, just putting my cards on the table, I think that values play a very important role in research, right? Because if it's you're going to be spending a lot of time, if you're going to do a research project, you're going to be spending a lot of time on this particular question. You're going to be reading, countless pages about it. You're going to be going out doing countless interviews. You're going to be spending countless hours transcribing those interviews, analyzing that data. If it's something that you're not passionate about, it's going to be very hard to find the motivation to actually push yourself through it, right? So I think values do play a critical role, especially in your choice of topic, right? And that's probably one of the places where values play the biggest part. However, if you're doing qualitative research, you have to say right up front, here's my background, here are my biases, they could affect my interpretation of this particular data. Here are the strategies that I'm using to try to control for my biases. I'm doing something called member checking, where when I transcribe an interview, I send it back to the person I was interviewing and say, is this exactly what you were trying to say? Is this what you said? You do things like triangulation, right, where you try to use different types of data sources to sort of corroborate your data, your findings, right? So not only are you using interviews, perhaps you're using surveys as well, right, or observations. So there are all these strategies out there that you can utilize to try to account for your biases. But when you're doing a social paper, for the most part, values are going to play a role, right? That's a big part of, and it's a big distinction between doing natural science research and social science research. So yeah, bias is certainly something that we want to try to avoid as much as we can. However, it's very challenging to leave our values out of it. But that doesn't mean, just because we are bringing our values into it, that there is no validity or no reliability to the information that we're finding, and we're just expressing our opinions, right? there are ways to find reliable information, even when you're working from a more subjective or qualitative perspective. So yeah, is it possible to eliminate bias from social science research? No, probably not. Can we account for it as much as we can? Yes, we probably can. So yeah, that's sort of bias, and that's the role that your own personal experience can play in your research. And the last thing he said was audience. Who are you writing for? Right. So if I'm writing an article to a much more positivistic, quantitative journal, I'm going to have to sort of make sure that my methods are meeting up, and the worldview that I'm coming from matches up with that particular journal. Otherwise, I'm not going to get the paper published. Right. Same thing if I decide to go more constructivist or interpretivist route, I need to make sure that I'm taking those things into account. So audience can play an important role when you're trying to decide where you fall sort of on the spectrum. Okay, so that's enough rambling for me for this week anyway. Don't forget, I'll post the discussion question on Wednesday. Keep up the good work on that. We've got a quiz coming up on Friday. And the extra credit discussion will be up. So I really encourage you guys to do that, because the reason that I've done that is because I think it's really going to help you. I think it's going to help you you're not required to do it, but I do think it will help you both in this class and moving forward. Okay, have a good week and enjoy the rest of your Memorial Day.